Hey, good evening. I'm Clay Horton.
I'm Sydney Patrick.
And Denise Robinson.
And we want to welcome you to the Red Letter Podcast. Tonight we'll be having conversations about loving our enemy, which I think is one of the most difficult teachings that Jesus gives us. So we'll be looking at scriptures from Jesus, and we're also going to be incorporating the book Red Letter Revolution by Tony Campolo and Shane Claiborne. So we'll be referring to this book throughout the podcast, and if you haven't had a chance to read it, it's extremely thought-provoking and challenging and fun, and we'd love for you to read that as well. If you're watching on Facebook right now, feel free to comment, or if you're watching it later, drop some comments as well, and we'll try to respond and maybe answer some other questions you might have on Facebook. So let's begin.
I'm going to start by reading the scripture passage for you. This is from Matthew 5, verses 43 through 47. You have heard that it was said, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? So what do y'all think of those words of Jesus?
To me, I was just like, well, God loves your enemies, and he loves you, so you need to love your enemies. And it made me think, who is someone that considers me an enemy?
When I looked at it from a more theological perspective, I kind of wanted to know what love meant. And so in Greek, there's different words that are used for love, whereas in the English language, we just say love for everything. And in this case, it's the word agape, and the definition of agape love is goodwill and benevolence. And so that made me think, okay, loving my enemies doesn't mean that I have to love them like I love my family. It doesn't mean that I have to love them like I love my best friend. And that gave me thought, what does it mean? Mm-hmm. Perhaps it means changing my mind, or opening my mind, or praying for them. I don't know. Forgiving them.
Agape is not always natural, right? Like eros, which is the erotic type, you've got that natural attraction. Philios is that brotherly love that you have, but agape has to come from God, right? It's without God, feeling God's love for us, it's really hard to care for anybody else sometimes.
So loving your enemy is almost a conscious act. It's not just a feeling. It's not just, a feeling of, this is my child, I love them. It's much more than that.
Yeah.
Like you said, one, it's a conscious act, but also that it's goodwill. Mm-hmm. So you're not wishing evil on your enemy.
Yeah.
And I think that ties in really well with, loving your enemies and what we've been reading in the book and bringing in evil and what that's like as well.
Yeah, because we can recognize somebody as an enemy because maybe they're doing harm to us or harm in our life, but then wishing revenge or wishing more harm to come upon them, that's not what Jesus is calling us to do. He's calling us to still want the best for them, and maybe the best for them is that their heart changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In what scenario is the best for them? Punishment or like extreme punishment, death penalty. I can't imagine Jesus being like, oh yeah, that person, if we fully love them, we should kill them. Like that's not Christ at all.
Yet I don't think he meant that there aren't consequences to behavior. Just like as a parent, we don't allow our kids to get away with everything. There's consequences sometimes. It's just the consequence has to be the right consequence, not a revenge-motivated consequence.
Yeah, that's the way I see it as well.
I think that makes the difference.
On Sunday, I mentioned that I had my introduction to Christian theology professor made us memorize 3 passages. And this was one of the passages we had to memorize in order to pass the class. And out of all the things Jesus said, I think he had us memorize this because it's both the hardest teaching and yet at the heart of really starting to understand God's love for us, and then God's desire for all of us to be in a deeper relationship with other people.
And it's countercultural.
Oh, extremely. Yeah.
That makes it hard. So who's our enemy? Who do y'all think our enemy is?
When I read this, I originally went directly to enemies around the world. I thought about war. I thought about politics. And I thought about people that we might be hurting in those two scenarios.
And it's interesting, growing up in my generation, we had a very clear enemy, and that was the Soviet Union. And everything we heard about was about the Soviet Union and that they're our enemy, and we wanted to defeat them in everything from the Olympics to the Cold War to everything else. And it was constantly in our face.
Yeah. And what I appreciate about Shane Claiborne in this is that he talks about his trip to Iraq. And right as the war was getting started over there, he took a group of people to just build relationships and to say, we don't have a desire to kill you or your families. And he was trying to build bridges over there in the midst of a war about to start, which completely shifts who we think about as our enemy. When I remember when 9/11 happened, I was sophomore in high school, and my first thought when I realized that it was an attack, well, George Bush is going to get even. And that was what welled up in me in the high school locker room, right? And what welled up in Shane was, I have to go meet these people because they can't all be evil. And he built relationships with them and played with their kids. That's loving enemies. And anyway, so Shane is a great example of somebody who challenges what is the status quo for us too often.
Yeah, and I think that's true with, when we have an enemy around the world, or, somebody that we're not in relationship with, it's easy to not put a face to the enemy. We just have a name. And it's easier to hate a name than it is a face that you actually spend time getting to know and realize these are people that love their families and care for their children. And that takes a whole different take. But do we have enemies that we are in relationship with? We might not use that word enemy, but there are people out there that constantly rub us the wrong way or have harmed us or someone we love. And we might not call them enemy, but they are. And loving them is hard. There's people out there, maybe even our own families, that are really hard to love. And how do we do that? How do we love them?
I think it's interesting because it's like a connection between holding a grudge and associating them as an enemy. Because, the reason they are an enemy is because they did something to you, or unless they're across the world, they did something to make you think that of them. So is the question also, how do you get rid of your grudges?
So it
Does
comes
that
back
help
to
you love better if you don't hold grudges?
It comes back to it's about me
Yeah.
instead of about them.
Yeah.
There's something that's got to change in me.
Right, and I think that's a big piece of this, and and loving your enemy, I don't think ever involves staying in an abusive relationship or anything like that. But once removed, how does one do the healing they need to do? Maybe finding forgiveness and reconciliation, or maybe never talking to that person again, but trying not to be wounded on a daily basis by somebody they've now removed themselves from, I think requires a whole lot of, it's counseling and it's prayer, and it's a whole lot of healing that has to go into it. And so one of my friends asked me, they said, what if your enemy or somebody you've struggled with has passed away? How do you find healing in that relationship? Because it's not going to be found on earth, but how do you love your enemy, and what is healing and reconciliation look like? So I'm curious about y'all's thoughts on that.
Well, and I think that can even be a bigger question. Even if somebody hasn't passed away, there are some relationships that the conflict will never be resolved. There won't be reconciliation, and how do you deal with that? And so I think you have to get to a place of not having bitterness reside in your heart. And I don't think there's a formula that's, okay, on day one, you're going to do this. I think that process, I think people put so much pressure on themselves to get to that quickly. And I think that can be a really long process of constantly praying. And the bottom line is, I don't know that anybody can do it by themselves. It takes the strength of Jesus. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think going back to the love. So are you putting Christ first because he gives you more love than so you can give other people love, like we talked about last week? So if you're putting Christ first, will that help you forgive that person and move on a little quicker? Or I guess maybe work within yourself, and I don't know. That's hard.
It is.
I appreciate what Daniel said in his sermon when he preached on this. He said, with any of our enemies, dead or alive, ask the question, what else could be true?
Right.
And then recognize that most people are doing their best, and then recognize that that person is a child of God. And so I imagine that healing can happen, and it's not going to happen right away, but really working through those questions. And that person that wounded me, the Korean understanding for sin is often wound. And so often we are wounded by somebody who has also been wounded. And then when we are wounded, then we wound somebody else. So in this process of building enemies, we're wounding one another. Mm-hmm. And sometimes even just recognizing that the person who has wounded us has also been wounded.
And it's not all that different when we go on mission trips. And when, the mission trips I go on, we always try to share some thoughts ahead of time, because we're meeting people that are different than us. And we might have perceived notions about them ahead of time. And so one of the things we always say is it's not wrong, it's just different. Well, we can say that about enemies, too. It's the way they're acting, the way, sometimes it is wrong. I recognize that. Sometimes there's evil, as we've talked about. But just opening our minds to an alternative interpretation to something.
So who hurt them to make them hurt us
right,
the way they did?
Right.
But but you're totally right, though. And even one's actions and how we interpret that might be evil or wrong, or somebody else's actions, what they're doing their action out of honesty, loyalty, a specific purpose. And, the NFL kneeling is kind of an example of, there's just been this culture creating enemies, right? If you kneel, you're this, or if you don't kneel, you're this. And without understanding the intent behind the behavior, and because so many folks haven't stopped to understand the intent behind the kneeling, they've just said, well, they're an enemy, as opposed to hearing what the movement's about. And so it's just, enemies have risen, and people have dug in their heels, and love hasn't been a part of that understanding.
And I think as humans, we're really good at spreading that information. A lot of the time you'll see an article on Facebook and you're like, oh yeah, that's terrible. And you like it, or you send it. You might not even repost it or share it, but you send it to someone else and you're like, oh, look what they did. Look what just happened. And whether it's about criminals or rapists or whoever it may be, someone that in many people's eyes would be an enemy, but we're perpetuating that. Mm-hmm. And that's not love.
Right.
It's gossiping.
It's gossip. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And don't you think as Christians, because this is a hard teaching, that we have found ways to think that doesn't apply to us in these situations when we're in a climate right now where opposing viewpoints can reach to a volume that is just incomprehensible, when people disagree politically or over even small things in there, and yet we think it's okay to not love them and to say they're wrong, and because we're not really subscribing to this.
Right. Yeah, we demonize, we name call, and it's interesting. Sometimes you even watch the news, and some news outlets use wrong nicknames for people. So as opposed to saying the person's name, they'll put the kind of the slander name in front of it, and it's like, whoa, this is like the news, right? Like, you're just supposed to report, like, this person did this, but now you're using these derogatory terms for this person. As like, so it's embedded so much in our culture that, like, yeah, that's the enemy, and so everything we think, say, and do becomes against this group or that person. And that's not healthy at all.
I think it's fascinating when you look at this verse in Matthew, the verses preceding it in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus talks about 3 actions that people could take, one of which is if someone, to turn your other cheek. You've heard that before, turn the other cheek. If someone hits you in the cheek, turn your other cheek. And then one is, if they take your outer coat, give them your inner coat as well. And then, or if they make you walk a mile, walk another mile with them. And we don't think of those, we just read those, but those were written in times where people were forcing people to do things they didn't want to do. The walk your mile was when a Roman soldier would come up to somebody and just grab a citizen off the street and say, carry my bag for this mile, and they were obligated to do so. And then Jesus is saying, don't stop at a mile, continue carrying it. And they were walking side by side with someone who truly was their oppressor, who really was their enemy. And I think we forget sometimes that there are ways to love an enemy that is very countercultural.
Mm-hmm. Well, thinking back to the cake fiasco, right, of not wanting to make cakes for same-sex weddings. Like, if the people making the cakes had just said, we don't agree with you, but we're going to make you the best cake you've ever had. And we're going to love you, and we're going to care for you. We're going to make sure we do a great job for you. Like, that's loving your enemy as opposed to saying, I'm going to deny you service, but we too often will love our enemies when it's convenient, and when it's not convenient, we try to throw out some other Bible verses and go, oh, no, I'm just going to live into this, and totally these people are now my enemies because they're against God, or whatever we want to say with that.
Well, and in that scenario, perhaps there's a way that someone could still abide by their beliefs, whatever they are, and yet not be ugly about it, not be hurtful and harmful. I don't know if there is, but there could be.
One of the alternatives that I heard for that was saying, we're going to give 50% of our proceeds or 100% of the proceeds if we don't agree with this marriage. We're going to give all the proceeds to some organization that couple might not like, right? And then they're like, oh, I'm going down the street because I don't want to support this business. But that would have been
or what about even just
way.
Being transparent on your advertising ahead of time, so they don't even allow themselves to be harmed in that way. You just don't know.
Yeah.
There's different things. Sydney, earlier you had talked a little bit about war. Go a little deeper into that. You just kind of glossed over it.
Yeah, I think a lot of this book focuses on 2 viewpoints, 2 different generations, and that really stuck out to me when it comes to war, because I think the younger generation has a vastly different viewpoint of the older generation, and in part that's because we haven't seen the same kind of war that maybe my parents saw or my grandparents saw, and we're not, most of us are not affected in the same way that our older family members have been affected. And so I think it's really easy for me to say, I'm very opposed to war. I think it's wrong. I think it's a very straightforward thing that killing people is bad and it is wrong. And there's always the other side of they're doing it to protect us. And that's what creates the 2 different viewpoints. And that, I think that makes for a good discussion.
Yeah, I think it does. And it's interesting how we shift to say, oh, well, this is defense spending, and the United States spends more than the next 7 countries combined on our defense spending. And this is the same country that says, oh, we're Christian, we'll turn the other cheek, or we'll choose not to kill in certain instances. But that's more than China and Russia, Saudi Arabia, all those combined. I'm just like, what? Who are we trusting in? Is our hope and our salvation in our missiles, or is it in Jesus? And so I really wrestle with, I understand the need for some type of defense, but when it's at the cost, over 54% of our discretionary budget is on defense. I'm like, how could we be creative and bring life to not only the U.S., but the rest of the world? That's where I mourn the fact that we haven't, as a Christian community, been able to maybe encourage the folks in power to be more creative with our spending.
And it's a subject I'm really conflicted on, and I'm conflicted on it because I come from a family that has many that have served in the military, and I'm proud of their service, and I'm proud of what they've accomplished that's been for good, and there have been things for good, but at the same time I am uncomfortable with war, and I always wonder, is there a different way to solve that, to have those discussions? And it creates an angst in me. And I've been fortunate to live in another country and meet people from other countries and see some commonalities between people in other cultures. Yet at the same time, this whole war topic is very uncomfortable for me, and how that ties in with Christianity.
And what's really interesting is we are in the place and in the country we're in part because people fought for this, and we get to openly discuss it, and that's something to really be thankful for.
Awesome.
And have these different viewpoints.
Yeah, and out of any country we could have been born into, what a blessing, right? I mean, so it's not a knock on the U.S. at all, and I think what has happened has been a shift from patriotism to nationalism, and patriotism says, I love my country, and I love what we stand for, and I love our freedoms that we have, and I recognize that people have served, and people have died for this country and for this Constitution, which is one of the greatest experiments in the history of humankind. And so that is patriotism, saying, yeah, America's great, and because we embrace all people, and nationalism is saying, we are the best, and we are only concerned with ourselves.
Putting ourselves first, not putting anybody else.
And that's scary, right?
And it also doesn't fit with the American dream, I don't think. And
the dream that my Jewish grandfather fought in World War II for, right? I mean, yeah, so I've got that same, I am proud that he served, and it's awesome, but I wonder what he would be thinking now as he looks around and goes, well, I wonder if he would be mourning right now at some of the loss of what America could and should be.
Well, and that's interesting, leads into one of the things Shane Claiborne said in the book, was that this doesn't mean that we should be pacifists, because being a pacifist means being totally passive and not reacting at all. And there are times that we should seek justice, that we should be justice seekers and recognize evil that exists. So there's a difference in what does it mean to not promote war, yet at the same time not sit back. And that's a very uncomfortable place to be, really and truly.
And how do you do that as a single person?
Right. What difference can we make on our daily basis?
Yeah, I think it starts as individuals, but I also see the church as a movement too, and that started with the cross, right? That Jesus was not passive in any way. If he had been passive, he wouldn't have gotten killed. But he was a nonviolent resistor, so he continually pushed back in different ways, and because of that, he was crucified. But the cross is this sign of nonviolent resistance that ends in ultimate victory. And so Jesus paints this picture of what victory looks like, and it's drastically different than anything that involves violence and fighting out against one's own aggressor.
Shane and Tony talked about breaking laws and essentially which laws are okay to be broken, and it's the ones that are wrong. And I think it was Shane that said that he went out and slept under a bridge with a group of homeless people, and people got arrested for it. And that was a law that needed to be broken because he was sleeping with someone that could have been considered an enemy. There are people that A lot of other people don't want to pay taxes to take care of people that they don't want on the streets because it makes the roads look bad and it brings the community down. And those were the laws that aren't the ones to be followed.
Yeah.
So how would the church look different? How would the church today look different if we really took this passage seriously? I mean, I can tell you one thing. It would look a lot more like our habitat build, our interfaith habitat build, where we're loving in ways with people that think differently than us. Mm-hmm. And some of those same people we shared a work site with, we have heard have been harmed by people that have hated them, that have gone in and done some pretty drastic things in the name of hate, and even in the name of Christianity.
Yeah, I think if we really took this serious, the church can be the strongest force for good in the world, right? We would have the ability to dream and be creative and to create a better world where there truly are less enemies, because we've lived into justice, right? So those people that were oppressed, we've helped kind of right some of those wrongs and brought them into right relationship. And so there's less need for evil, less need for oppression, less violence because of this or that, because less people are being wounded. And if we can kind of stop the bleeding, stop the wounding, then we begin healing. And Christ is the ultimate healer. That's the message of Christ.
I think in order to do that, we need to go out of our comfort zone. And a lot of us are very comfortable in this bubble that we live in. And, the furthest I go on most days is to work and back. That's 11 miles. You don't get much out of this bubble 11 miles from here.
Yeah.
But what about even praying for that perceived enemy, that enemy? What if I prayed for some of the people that have strongly different political views than me? What if I prayed for some of the people in other parts of the world that I think are doing horrible things? And I can honestly say I'm not good about that. Mm. But what if I did that? I mean, and if everybody did that and we started saying, we are praying not that my will be done, but that God's will. I mean, the end of this verse says, the sun shines on everybody. The rain falls on everybody. It doesn't make a difference because they're all God's children.
Yeah, I appreciate the work Shane Claiborne has done around the death penalty, and he's become friends with people. He's created pen pals with a number of people on death row, and he now sees them as friends, as brothers and sisters. And what he reminds us is that the most executions happen in the Bible Belt. So the place where people say they believe in grace, say they believe in forgiveness and reconciliation, is the same place that's killing the most people. And yet the places that are where the church is in rapid decline, where Christianity's kind of going by the wayside, are the places where people are becoming awakened and saying, this is an archaic practice. We can't kill people anymore. And he laments the fact that the world is looking at the Bible Belt and saying, wait, we thought you were the Christians, but you're killing the most people. And he brings up extremely valid points around that argument.
Well, and the reality is, this is not an easy topic, and it's not something that we're going to have answers to in a few 30-minute podcasts.
We solved nothing tonight?
We've solved nothing, but maybe we've opened our minds to seeing things a little differently. Yeah. Maybe it's the start.
And maybe with love, we can all be more loving, and as a result, a lot happier people.
Yeah.
So next week, join us again, 8 o'clock. We'll be talking about love wins and reading verse Mark 12:28 through 34.